Well, Oklahoma's Commissioner of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, Terry White, has a job that is as much about education as it is treatment. I visited with her in a Spartan conference room just outside her office. So, Terry, what type of impact is mental illness having on the state of Oklahoma?
Actually, mental illness is the third leading cause of chronic disease in our state. Only pulmonary conditions and hypertension are more common. There are more people struggling with mental illness than there are struggling with heart disease, diabetes, cancer, or stroke in Oklahoma.
And that has to have both an economic and social impact.
Absolutely. Mental illness and addiction are diseases like any other disease. Just like diabetes is a disease of the pancreas, where your pancreas doesn't secrete the right amount of insulin, mental illness and addiction are diseases of the brain, where the chemicals in the brain aren't being secreted correctly, or in the case of addiction, where because of additional chemicals in the body are causing chemical reactions that otherwise wouldn't have been there. Well, just like any disease, if you have diabetes, heart disease, or the more common disease of mental illness, when it goes untreated, then we see dire consequences. We see obviously the consequences to people's health, but we see the beginning of breakup of families. You see people losing their employment when they're struggling with mental illness and addiction when they don't get access to treatment. Ultimately, you can see people ending up in the criminal justice system because they can't get help anywhere else. And then finally, some of the worst outcomes is when we see people who lose their lives, either due to drug overdose, suicide, or other things.
I've seen studies that says Oklahoma has one of the highest rates of mental illness. Why is that?
So we actually have the second highest rate of mental illness in the United States. And a lot of times when I say that, people say, well, how can that be? Well, if you look at all of our health statistics, we're often ranked at the bottom. We're not good in health. We are 48th, 49th, and 50th, and that's bad. So the year we were ranked 43rd, we were really excited. Well, we have high rates of all diseases. So when you have high rates of all disease, of course you're going to also have high rates of brain disease. What would be really weird is if we had these really unhealthy bodies from the neck down and had these bizarrely healthy brains trapped in these really unhealthy bodies. But as long as we're not healthy as a whole, we're going to have high rates of mental illness and addiction because they're just like any other disease. It's just it affects a different organ. It's the brain as opposed to the heart or the lungs or the pancreas.
So we know we have the problem.
Absolutely.
What do we do about it?
Well, one of the biggest challenges we have in Oklahoma is that we're only able to serve about 1/3 of Oklahomans who need help. So on any given day, about 2/3 of Oklahomans, and I'm talking about adults and our youth, because mental illness is a disease of the young. Half of all mental illness emerges by age 14, 3/4 of all mental illness emerges by age 24. And addiction also begins when people are young. It's not something we have to think about, gosh, as I get older, as I get into my 70s or 80s, am I going to develop mental illness or addiction? It doesn't work like that. And the fact is, for our youth and our adults, about 2/3 of Oklahomans who need help can't get access to services. And it is a resource issue.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say resources, are we just talking about money?
And so there's a couple things that we're talking about. One of the biggest challenges, and I know it's not everyone's favorite topic, but one of the biggest challenges is resources, it's funding. Because for decades, no fault of the current administration, in fact, Governor Fallin has been very supportive of issues related to mental illness and addiction and funding treatment and prevention. But what we know is that for decades, these issues were misunderstood and neglected, so we are now trying to recover from decades of neglect. The other thing that we know that really gets in the way of treatment is the stigma that surrounds mental illness and addiction. And it gets in the way in a couple of ways. One gets in the way of it being a funding priority. When people are running for office, they run on education, they run on roads and transportation, they run on taxes. Very rarely do you have people who run saying, I'm going to help Oklahoma's brains in terms of mental illness and addiction. Although that would actually make a huge difference in our state in everything, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what we also know is the stigma keeps people from asking for help. That somehow people will say, if I was wearing a pink ribbon today, you might know I was standing up for breast cancer, and we could talk about that. People whose children need asthma, make sure that the school nurse knows, here's their asthma medication. We get help for heart disease. We have beautiful new cancer centers around our state. But the fact is, with mental illness and addiction, somehow, completely inaccurately, there's sort of a stigma that relates to those diseases. People are either afraid to ask for help or they think maybe treatment doesn't work, but that's absolutely not true. These diseases can be successfully treated just like any other disease, but not if people never get medical care.
So is the first step for the state just to recognize that it is a problem and there's something that we all should be doing?
Absolutely. I think the first step, like you're saying, is there's a role for all of us. One is that we have to start talking about these issues among our families, the same way that if we had heart disease that ran in our families, we would talk about it. And we need to talk about mental illness and addiction. Not only do we need to talk about it there, but we need to talk about it in our schools. We need to help identify people at a much younger age instead of waiting until the consequences. And what I mean by that is, We don't need to wait until someone's getting in trouble in school, youth who appear to have acting out behavior, but what it really is an untreated mental illness or addiction issue. We don't need to wait till our youth drop out of high school or drop out of college because they're struggling. We don't need to wait until we've got someone who's become employed but is now struggling with mental illness or addiction and is beginning not to show up at work and they end up losing their job. We need to not wait until we end up at ultimately where people are ending up in the back of a police car, the inside of a jail cell, or the inside of a prison cell because they have an untreated disease as opposed to entering a medical facility.